welcome to this week's episode of Did Shakespeare. I hope you and yours are staying safe during the outbreak of COVID-19. I thank you very much for spending part of your quarantine here with us this week on Did Shakespeare. This week, we are doing a plague-themed episode to take a look at what Shakespeare did during times of plague. And we're doing that by asking the question, did Shakespeare write during plague? The answer to this question is decidedly yes. He did write during times of plague, but that's almost because there were so many outbreaks of plague during the life of William Shakespeare that he could hardly have done anything else. Elizabethan theaters were frequently shuttered in London during outbreaks of plague, which went through various cycles throughout the life of William Shakespeare. In fact, the year William Shakespeare was born, he was born during an outbreak of plague, and many historians say that Shakespeare's first and greatest accomplishment was simply that he lived to grow up. Bubonic plague would take over the city several times a year, and it would go on to claim nearly a third of the city's population when they would outbreak like that. The official rule for when to close the theater was whether or not deaths per week exceeded the rate of 30 people a week. In that case, all performances would be canceled. Now, outbreaks of plague in London could be so bad as to claim hundreds and even thousands of people every week. So these outbreaks would frequently be larger than 30 a week, in which case all the public playhouses were closed. London officials in the 16th century, like what's happening today, would not want people to gather in groups. They wouldn't want them to get together in close quarters, and the playhouse were both of these things. It was where the largest gatherings of people in the city would occur, and they were all packed in there together. So it was one of the first places, if not the top of the list of places of things to shutter and close away during outbreaks of plague. In fact, during the first year of King James's reign in 1603, it's likely that theaters were closed more than they were open. In these instances, the King's Men, which was Shakespeare's playing company, they became the King's Men when King James officially patronized them. Before that, they were the Lord Chamberlain's Men, which is a good example of why the statement Elizabeth patronized William Shakespeare is not true, but that's a topic we cover in a different episode. I'll link to that episode below this video. It's long been thought that Shakespeare turned to poetry when outbreaks of plague would take over the city, and he did do that on several occasions. In 1593, when plague closed the theaters, he published his popular narrative poem, Venus and Adonis. It's a good example of Shakespeare writing during plague because in it, he wrote about a goddess who begs a kiss from a beautiful boy and uses the phrase to drive infection from a dangerous year. It was thought that poetry could banish the plague. James Shapiro suggests that another closure of theaters in 1606 allowed Shakespeare, as an actor and shareholder in the King's Men, to do a lot of dramatic writing. It would be the year 1606 when Shakespeare would write King Lear, Macbeth, and Antony and Cleopatra. Professor Jonathan Bate, who has been a guest on That Shakespeare Life, and I'll link to his episode and interview below this video as well, states in his biography, Soul of the Age, that plague was the single most powerful force shaping Shakespeare's life and those of his contemporaries. After the theater closings of 1603, only 3 principal playing companies were even allowed to resume performances in 1604, and they were only allowed to do that as long as the death rate remained below 30 a week. According to David Grote, who is author of The Best Actors in the World, Shakespeare and His Acting Company, from 1606 to 1610, the theaters were mostly closed. Plague houses under quarantine in London would have to be marked with a red cross over the door, and local authorities have records showing that it was a problem for people to come through and wash off the red cross so that they could leave their house. As the plague numbers grew substantially into the thousands, the Lord Mayor promised to respond with even harsher measures. They instituted things like expelling all the beggars from the city and posting watchmen outside of any infected house. And they would lock them in. You couldn't leave and you couldn't go in. This posting of watchmen outside the house and not letting anyone leave is actually one of the key plot elements of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. When Romeo writes a letter, and it's crucial that it gets delivered on time, The letter doesn't make it where it's supposed to go because the courier gets locked up in a plague house. And this is why he was not allowed to leave, because there would have been a watchman outside the house. Practically speaking, for London during this time, however, there weren't enough resources for them to actually put a watchman outside of every infected house. There were almost every home in London was infected with the plague. And so they didn't have the actual resources to enforce this, but it was one of the measures they sought. Interestingly, when plague spread through London, the parish that William Shakespeare lived in London was relatively spared from the plague compared to the rest of the city. Even at times when dozens of people were dying in other parts of London every week, St. Olave's records not a single death, or at least not a single burial from the death records we have, since April of 1606. The plague impacted Shakespeare's career in that not only did it drive most of his competitors out of London into country touring companies, but they also closed some theater companies entirely, strictly because so many of the players died from plague. Even though the King's Men did remain in London during the outbreak of plague in 1606, they performed several times before the royal court. Even the King's Men were driven to the country to find work as a touring company in 1606. They were touring in Oxford, Maidenhead, and Dover that summer. The outbreak of 1603, followed by the outbreak of 1606, which was significantly smaller than the one in 1603, they both served to create a damaging wound to Shakespeare's career from which he would never really fully recover. By the year of 1607, there's some evidence to suggest that Shakespeare was intentionally phasing himself out of management of the King's Men and into formal retirement, which coincided with this severe decline brought on by plague. In his book, David Grote provides evidence to suggest Shakespeare may not have even been in London when the King's Men were performing, but instead he could have been in Stratford for the wedding of his daughter, Susanna. Now, this is the summer of 1607. The King's Men do have records of performances in London during this time, but Susanna married John Hall on June 5th of 1607. So it's reasonable to think that Shakespeare was there for her wedding. Normal pattern for plague was to decline during the winter months, and while we know Shakespeare's company performed at least 9 times over the winter between 1606 and 1607, that doesn't necessarily mean those performances were at the Globe or even another playhouse. And it's worth noting, it also doesn't mean that every single one of those performances had William Shakespeare present. It was required by law that a sharer in the company be present for the performance, but the King's Men had lots of sharers in the company, and it didn't always have to be Shakespeare that was there. Additional revenue was happening during the time of plague for William Shakespeare. Even though public gatherings at a playhouse were not allowed, court performances would continue uninterrupted even during times of plague when the theaters were closed. It is thought for the brief period that the plague deaths dipped below the 30 a week in 1606 that Pericles could have been performed for a Venetian ambassador who had arrived in London in January of 1606. There were religious holidays and other standard breaks in theater performances that happened in January and February, which means that since we know the King's Men had gone on tour officially by early summer of 1607, that sometime between February and July of that year would have been when the Venetian ambassador saw Pericles. Again, that's a guess. We don't know for sure that he even saw it at all. The King's Men were back in London definitely by November of 1607 and would perform at court 13 times over November into December before Christmas of that year. Winter almost always brought on a cessation of plague, and the winter of 1607 into 1608 was one of the coldest on record. That was the year that the Thames River completely froze over, so much so that people could walk out onto the river, and there are even records of people building coal fires on the ice. Even during that bitter of a cold and in an atmosphere where you would have had to stand outside to see a performance, people still came out to see performances at the Globe that winter. They actually believed Pericles was the play that they came out to see. It was extremely popular, which is funny for us today because Pericles is not one of Shakespeare's most popular plays in the 21st century. When we look at the rise and fall of plague in Shakespeare's lifetime, it's incredible that he was spared so many times from this disease. And as much as anything else in his life, it seems plague shaped much of what we know about Shakespeare's career. That's it for this week. I'm Cassidy Cash. Thank you for hanging out here with me. I would like to ask you to please consider supporting the show and supporting the podcast that we produce each Monday here for you by joining our membership. Membership is $20 a month, and I'll send you a complete digital history activity activity kit. Each of these kits are called Experience Shakespeare, and they're like science labs for history. They're designed to let you experience a piece of Shakespeare's history for yourself, though not plague. You're experiencing enough of that for yourself. No, these things are like how to make marchpane, how to play at bowls, or how to dance the volta. All of these activities we have created to help you cook, play, and dance your way through turn of the 17th century England. In addition to the activities, you also get access to our entire resource library of printables, worksheets, maps, diagrams, and even some of my artwork is available in there for free downloads. These are all made available monthly, but there is an annual subscription available as well, which gets you a few extra bonuses. And to get the full details or sign up now, go to castycash.com/experience. Remember that in response to COVID-19 and the many educators who now find their traditional classrooms have suddenly moved online and are looking for resources. If that's you and you are teaching Shakespeare history or the history of early modern England and are looking for some things you can give your students quickly, from now through June 1st, I'm giving completely free access for educators to the entire membership library here at That Shakespeare Life, which you can access by using the code TEACH2020. That's teach with a lowercase t and then 2020 like the year. I hope that helps you as you are learning with social distancing and much online education during this time. Please stay safe and wash your hands like Lady Macbeth. Thank you for watching. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.